So we've seen that in the soul view, the body view, and the personality view, in trying to tell us what personal identity is, or all have problems. So we're going to suggest now in this video that maybe the question they're trying to ask, what is personal identity, maybe there's something a little bit off about that question. So there's some background assumptions that these views are making. So they're more or less background assumptions about personal identity that these views are making. So they assume more or less that each of us is an independent, separate being, separate from all the other things, and that we each have sharp boundaries. And we can clearly say, in this case, it is me. In this other case, it's not me. And in every case, right, there's a sharp boundary. Either it is me or it's not me. And personal identity, well, there's this thing that is me right now, and we can ask, there's numerical identity of that being, and personal identity is just the numerical identity of me with myself over time. So I survive over a period. What does that mean? It means that there's a thing, me, at the beginning of that period, and there's a being at the end of that period that's numerically identical to me, and so is me. That's just what it is for me to survive. There's numerical identity over time. And what do we care about? And why do we fear death, for example? What we care about is survival of that being. Right? There's a being that I am, and what I care about most fundamentally is that this being that I am, that the being that I am survives. And what that means is that will there be something in the future to which I am numerically identical, right? Will I still continue to exist? A way of saying that is there something in the future to which I am numerically identical? Well, these background assumptions might be mistaken. So one, you might think of this, so here's a steel ball. Steel ball is basically homogeneous throughout, but what's more important is that it's basically unchanging, right? It has very clear, sharp boundaries, we imagine, and we imagine that it's basically unchanging. You can destroy it, right? It may cease to exist, but as long as it exists, it's going to exist as this steel ball. And on the other hand, we might have a heap of sand. So the parts of the steel ball are very sharp, are very closely connected, right? The heap of sand, no, it's just a lot of different grains, and they can change shape easily, and you can easily divide them into two heaps, and so it's like the opposite of a steel ball. It's got vague boundaries, and its internal pieces are not well connected. And I think, well, we're not. On the background assumption thinks of us as like a steel ball, and while we're not a steel ball, while we're not all the way on the other side of this, like a heap of sand, maybe we're in the middle. Maybe we're more like a river or like a hurricane. What would that mean? Well, maybe we're a process. Maybe each of us is only partially separate from the rest of our environment, and a changing thing a process that changes over time. And personal identity's numerical identity would make sense only in limited contexts and not be something we can always ask, am I identical or not, in a sensible way. And survival itself wouldn't be what we should care about or what we do care about. Something else would be what we care about. So I'm going to be sort of exploring these ideas in this video and the next. And in this video, I'm going to be focused on the idea that maybe survival of a numerically identical being is actually not so important, and that maybe something else is what matters. Maybe psychological continuity and our values are what matter. So we're going to look at some examples where we can pull apart what survives versus what matters in survival. So let's look at some cases to see how this happens. Let's look at some cases where we have survival without what matters in survival. So let's imagine that there are souls. Let's imagine not only that there are souls, but that souls get reincarnated. So what does that mean? It means that when the body dies, the soul survives, and it eventually gets stuck into a new body. And there are different ways in which lots of different religions and spiritual views have had this idea about reincarnations. Hinduism, Buddhism, but also a variety of views in the West, in ancient Greece, for example. Let's imagine, as we're understanding this reincarnation, that the memories are completely wiped away from the soul, so that this soul, when it's inhabiting this body, has no memory whatsoever of the life that was lived by the soul when it inhabited a previous body. And when this green body dies and the soul moves on to the next body, This body, the soul has now lost all of its memories of its previous life, and is living, more or less an entirely new life. And eventually the blue body will die, and the soul will move on. So on the soul view, if we agreed with the soul view, we haven't, but let's suppose it were correct. Well, on this reincarnation picture, the soul does survive, and so you have survived. But you have no memory of your previous incarnations, of the previous times you've been stuck into bodies. So we might ask, okay, so on the soul view, you've survived. Should you be happy that this is the case? We could contrast this with the situation where the soul is destroyed when your body dies. Is one of these better than the other? I don't see why. When you die, when the body dies, in both cases, all the memories are gone, completely gone. In one case because the soul has been destroyed, in the other case because the soul has been wiped free of its memories and it's going to move on to another body. Why is one of these better than the other? Think about it this way. Suppose the soul view were true. That means that you now are a soul that's existed for a long time before and has had many, many previous lives. Does your existence now make a difference to those previous lives? I don't see why it does. Yes, it's the same soul, but so what? Who cares? It is the same you in the sense that you're a soul, but why is that any good? Why does it matter for those previous for that person living that previous life? Why does it matter that you are now the same soul as that person? Maybe there's a story there, but it's not obvious why. And so it looks like, in this case, we have survival, on the soul view at least, but we don't have survival of whatever matters. Whatever matters has been lost. That whether you're reincarnated with no memory or your soul is destroyed, there's no difference. And so we have survival, but we don't have what matters. Let's consider a different view, the sort of Methuselah view. Let's imagine that human beings survive for thousands of years. Well, if this happens, over the course of a couple hundred years, your personality might change dramatically and radically, and it might change to one personality, and then over the next 300 years it changes to another personality. We could imagine that this personality change, now let's imagine it's continuous, right? So it's happening slowly, piece by piece, just like with the rope and the fibers, so that at any given point we say any two sort of adjacent snapshots of your personality are going to say, yeah, there's a huge amount of overlap, there are only small changes. So we have continuous personality change, and so according to the personality view, it's the same person. But let's imagine that this personality view, the personality we get by personality 3, 1,000 years out in the future, is absolutely opposed to your initial personality. So the final personality, initial personality, if they met, would be deadly enemies, right? They would be like, Nazis and the English, right? They just they hate each other. They have absolutely opposing values, and they want to destroy each other if they had ever met. Okay, so from the perspective of the person at the beginning of this, the person at the end is like the absolute worst person imaginable. So you've survived. Should you be happy about this case? Do you have what matters? It doesn't seem like it's very good. Is this much better than death? Not much, right? Yeah, there's in some sense you are still around, but everything you care about has been completely destroyed and altered. And what we're left with is this absolutely opposing view, absolutely opposing personality at the end. So again, we have survival, but do we have what matters? How much better is this than dying? Not a whole lot better. Maybe it's a little bit better, but really, I don't know. Like, this later person is running around doing all these horrible things, destroying everything that you cared about at the beginning of your life when you had personality 1. Is that good? Is that good for personality 1? Is that good for you right now? I don't think so. I'm not going to sort of decisively argue that it isn't, but it certainly doesn't seem like it's good. And finally, let's consider just a slight variant of this. So bodies last for a really long time, and they're complete personality replacements instead of on the body view again. imagine that these personality views, these different personalities completely lose their memories. So this is effectively like reincarnation, right? So every so often, the body just gets a completely new personality. How much better is this than death? I mean, this seems like this is a lot like the reincarnation scenario, because the later personality has no memory whatsoever of the previous lives, of everything that happened to the body previously. It's just bang, completely new personality in the body. How much better for the personality in the beginning is that than dying? Maybe it's a little bit better, but I don't know. Is it? I mean, there's no record of the previous life left. So in all these cases, we clearly have survival, but we don't have as much of what matters. Maybe we don't have any of what matters. Maybe it's actually bad, like in the first Methuselah case, where the later personality is completely opposed to the initial personality. So in all these cases, it looks like, yeah, there's on the different views of personal identity, we would have survival, but we don't have what matters. In the soul view, we have reincarnation with a completely wiped personality. Survival, but not what matters. On the body view, we have bodily survival with completely wiped personalities, not what matters. On the personality view, we consider the case where there's continuous personality change into the completely opposed personality. In all of these cases, we have survival, but these are not good scenarios. What we care about when we care about survival, we do not have these. So it looks like maybe what we care about when we care about survival is not survival itself, but something that normally accompanies survival. And it looks like we can have what matters without survival. That's what we have in the brain splitting case, right? The brain splitting case, you do not survive, right? Why? Because there's nothing that you're identical to afterwards. You're not identical to both of them, you can't be, and you're not identical to one but not the other because they have an equal claim on you. So you don't exist after the brain splitting case. But should you be scared of this? It seems like this is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. There your brain is continuing. Should you be scared of this? I mean, maybe you should be scared of it in the sense that, oh, what if the brain transplant goes wrong? But imagining that the brain transplant goes right, why would this be a bad thing for you? I mean, maybe the two personalities are going to fight or something, but that's not the same thing as being scared of death. And so effectively, you survived, but you've effectively survived, but you haven't literally survived. You haven't literally survived because you do not exist after the brain splitting and transplant. So in this case, what we have, it's as good as survival, but it's not survival. And so what we have in this case is what matters. We have what matters in survival, but we don't have actual survival, right? It's as good as survival. Yeah, you shouldn't fear this in the way that you fear death. You should basically be at least as happy, around as happy at the prospect of the brain splitting as you should be of just normal survival. So it's as good as survival, but do you survive? No, because there's nothing you're identical to afterwards. So what that tells us is what we have here is what matters in survival, but we don't have actual survival. And something similar is going on in the psychological branching case. Do you survive? No, because you're not identical to either of the beings. But you might think, yeah, this is pretty good. Maybe it's not as good as my body lasting, but is it as bad as death? No. You might think it's really nowhere near as bad as death. And so what matters in survival, what matters in survival happens to a substantial degree. And so, again, we have no survival because you're not identical to anything afterwards, but it's much better than death, and so we have most of what matters to survival without survival. Where most of what we care about happening in survival happens here even though we don't actually survive. Let's imagine another situation. So we have, when we were talking about the soul view, we imagined, oh, maybe souls could be replaced without being noticed. So let's imagine that actually happens to you. You are a soul, or you are, first of all, there are souls. Secondly, the soul view is correct, so you are a soul. And third, that souls get replaced every night without anybody noticing. So other people don't notice, you don't notice, so your soul has been replaced overnight. Should you care? Right, on the soul view, there's no survival because they're different souls. But your personality has been maintained, right? The soul replacement isn't noticed. Your body has been maintained because the soul replacement isn't noticed. It seems like, right, this is pretty good. Sure, the soul isn't around anymore, but what you care about, as far as what you can notice, yes, it's still there. So it seems like this is as good as, even though the soul is being replaced, this is as good as surviving. Literally, there's no survival because different souls and so different people, but it's as good, at least it certainly seems like it's as good. So in all these different situations, it looks like we don't have literal survival because there's not one specific entity that you're identical to with before and after. And yet these scenarios are as good or nearly as good as survival. And what that suggests is that what matters most about survival is that there's enough continuity of psychology and values, because that's what's common in all these cases. There's enough continuity of psychology before and after, even though there's not personal identity. And in particular, you're able to continue to pursue your values, there's the values that you have now. There's a being that's still pursuing them in basically the way that you do, that you would. So we can distinguish between the questions what matters in survival versus did I survive or did some person survive. So we can ask, if something happens, we ask, did the person survive? And the way we understand that is, does the person still exist? We want to know over a period of time, did the person survive? That's what that comes to is there one being numerically identical over time that exists at all the different points in that period or not? Second question is, does what matters in survival happen? And that's different. Maybe there was survival, but what's normally important about survival didn't happen. Or maybe what's normally important about survival did happen, but personal identity wasn't maintained, and so we don't have continued existence. So these are different questions, and personal identity theories or views try to help us answer the first kind of question by telling us what in general is required and sufficient for a being to be numerically identical over time. But they don't obviously help us answer number two, because they don't have anything to say about what actually matters. They're just trying to answer the numerical identity question, give criteria for numerical identity. They're not trying to say what matters. That's interesting. So we might think maybe in pursuing these theories of personal identity, we really haven't been focusing on what's most important. Okay, in the last video in this module, then, I'm going to try to say a little bit about what might be important and how that relates to what kind of thing we are.